So no doubt, everyone in this spiritual community has had a healing. No doubt that you have experienced a healing yourself and have witnessed someone having a healing. But raise your hand if you have ever wanted, desired, needed from the core of your being a healing so badly that you didn't feel it come and you didn't know how to navigate it and you wanted it to be there and to be done in a time much quicker than it was manifesting. Do we believe that? That we can't rush our healing? That even darkness has its teaching? That with anything and everything, even those things that seem unlike harmony, even those things that arrive in our lives that are very much unwanted, do we believe in some of the metaphysics in the scripture, I will not let go until you bless me? That there is an element of good that we can call forth in the midst of anything. Of anything. That if we allow ourselves the time and we ask ourselves the poignant question, what in this whole experience is for me? What can I do with this? What would you have me hear? Unity has its foundation, on healing. We're all here today in part because of a powerhouse woman that had a diagnosis. Unity's co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, heard these words in a talk that she went to. She heard the words, "I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness." So she was looking at the face of sickness. She was looking at it, and that was the appearance. That was her inheritance. That's what she knew. That was her future. That was her programming. That was her inevitable result in the world that she lived in at the time. But a consciousness struck her. Something hit her, and it shattered all of that, because when she heard those words, they radiated in her being as truth, even though her education, her body, and everything else told her that's not possible. And she held to that knowing, she held to that rhythm, to that vibration within her, and developed a practice. And that practice was an embodiment of this idea that I come from source, I come from perfect wholeness, and if I hold to that truth, that it's not even if I hold to that truth, because that implies trying, right? It's holding to that truth, just getting it so deeply, lets everything that is unlike it simply drift away back into the nothingness from which it came. So I do not need to treat this as if it is a monster under the bed, but in fact I can treat it as if it is a shadow. And if you've ever seen a child or an animal see their shadow for a first time, Google that on YouTube. There can be some like, what is that? What is that? You know, and you try to go for a shadow, right? What happens if you keep trying to go for a shadow? Do something to it. Futile, right? But once we know spiritual practice and once we know spiritual principles, we enter into a different state of consciousness. And this is a state of healing consciousness. When we know our wholeness so deeply, and unity is founded on this practice, it is founded on the practice of not only knowing it for ourselves, but knowing it for each other. That is the mission of silent unity, is standing in that knowing like a tuning fork. So even though we may hear, even though all of these stories, of all of this discord, of all of these prayer requests that we get with each other and that we hold collectively, even though they come, we don't shake and we don't shudder. We look straight through them to the core of truth. Some people say that the master teacher healed because the master teacher didn't see that there was disease or sickness. There was just pure seeing into the light, the truth, the beauty. Charles and Myrtle's son, Lowell Fillmore, wrote the prayer way to health, wealth, and happiness. He said, we must work out God's divine blueprint in our bodies. We must work out God's divine blueprint in our bodies. And Myrtle Fillmore took on a practice of every cell in her body, of affirming the life in every cell of her body. So taking a diagnosis, taking something that looked like illness or dis-ease, and going, every cell in my body is strong. I see the life. I see the life. I call it forth in you. I see it. I see it. I see it. How often do we, though, in our illness, just see what is wrong, right? Rather than looking straight through it like it's a shadow and call it forth. Charles Fillmore, in The Revealing Word, said all healing is based on mental cleansing. He talked about relieving the mind from error, and that relieving creating harmony in the body. He repeatedly taught about the spirit-mind-body connection and how it is intrinsically intertwined. Science is demonstrating this today. Spirit, mind, and body. That we are a full being and everything is connected. Charles said that the mind of peace precedes bodily healing. The mind of peace precedes bodily healing. I want to share a couple of pieces from the book, The Master Speaks, Joel Goldsmith. He talks about this shadow and he talks about the healing work. Before I say this, I want to say that I have invited a special friend to be with us today, Rev Brenda Ehret, who's going to share this platform with me. Because when we have a healing story, it's ours to share. And when we have a healing, it doesn't mean that every exact piece of how we got it is going to be for someone else. But when we share our stories, we know that we radiate and reverberate a healing consciousness around. And when one person demonstrates healing, it's a healing for everyone. So listen to each other's stories, no? Express your story of healing and your story of wholeness. And I'm so glad to have Rev Brenda Ehret here with us today to share. He says this on healing. Our spiritual integrity lies in the degree of our awareness that the nothingness of what appears to be sin, disease, lack, limitation, and all the rest of the discords of human experience. Should we pass around the basket and we can all throw it in there? All the rest of the discord. Just throw it in there in your mind. Take it all. Of discords of the human experience. He says, we, however, must practice. This is unity as a practical teaching, that we must practice. We must develop the ability to look error of any form right in the face and not get this thinking process of ours working. What thinking process? He refers to the thinking process that starts building up a wall, the thinking process that gets so disturbed. He says, to the degree to which we can look at the shadow and not be disturbed by it, we are increasing and expressing our Christhood, our enlightened state of consciousness, our spiritual truth. He says there must be no resistance to this error. Error is to be recognized as nothingness. We don't have to, he says, hate it, fear it, or love it. We don't have to hate it, fear it, or love it. Knowing that it exists only as a shadow of belief a mortal belief. So can we develop the inner ability to show up, to act, to be, to co-create, but not from a place of turmoil, from a place of center and peace? He goes on to say, do not set up a mental wall against it. Do not set up a mental rebellion against it. Do not set up a mental denial against it, but learn to wait in silence. He goes on to say, in other words, open our eyes that we may see that there is no enemy, there is no opposition. Those who are for us are more than those who are against us. As a matter of fact, we have to go the full distance and see that there are none against us, but that what appears to us as an enemy in the form of sin, disease, lack, or limitation represents the universal sense which is always around us. The secret of healing work is found in this particular unfoldment, in this particular lesson.
My lesson really began June 2nd, 1993, and I was at the time in the insurance business. I sold group insurance to small businesses. I was driving back to the office on a Wednesday afternoon, and coming off the freeway on a fairly busy street in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I noticed for the first 2 or 3 traffic lights that there was one of those compact pickups, like a Chevy S10, tailgating me, and every time I pulled up to a traffic light, I checked in the rearview mirror to see that he knew I was stopped. So this went on for several minutes. I turned off of that street onto a much quieter street, just two little lane street. 2 cars ahead of me, a car had stopped to make a left turn. So the car ahead of me pulled up to a stop. I rolled up to a stop. And just as I stopped, I thought, I wonder if that pickup is still behind me. Not the brightest bear in the group. I didn't simply avert my eyes to my rear view mirror. I turned in my seat, saw that he had no clue that I was stopped and was going to ram into my car. So I curled my knees up to my chin and pulled my head toward my chest as I was twisting. And he ran into the back of my car. So having nowhere to pull off, I pulled as closely to the curb as I could so that we could exchange information. And as I pulled over and put it in park, I turned my head to open my door, and he drove past me. I had the presence of mind, somehow, some way, to write down his license plate. 2 days later, my son was graduating from high school and had already been accepted where he was going to be going to college. So it was a big mark in my life. I had been a single parent since he was about 18 months, very, very, very close to my son, and just it was my primary purpose in life to help nurture the most wonderful person that I could. And I knew for myself, because I had devoted all of my adult life to raising this child, well, when he goes off to college, I'll get a life. And then in the interim, while he was in high school, I met this man who happened to be my neighbor, and we later married. I had 2 stepsons and my son in college. And it occurred to me once again, I've had 3 points in my life, actually, that it occurred to me that I forgot to get a plan. So I had this general idea that after my son was in college, that I could explore my life and explore myself. And I don't know if anyone sees the metaphysics in the timing of my little car crash, 2 days before high school graduation. So the morning of his graduation, I went to a physician, my MD, and nothing's broken. Take a couple aspirin. If you're not better Monday, call me. Chronic pain very quickly had my full attention. I'm talking about eye-watering, 24 hours a day chronic pain. I could not look up. I could not sit. And so I continued to work. 9 months later, I thought, I think I'm going to get some treatment. So I started with a chiropractor. Never been to a chiropractor in my life. I had an interview with her, and I had to sit in a chair in her office, and so I was squirming in the chair. The chronic pain was about almost continual muscle spasms and almost continual electric nerve impulses down my sciatica, and a neck that I couldn't use or turn. So every morning, my pre-waking thought was, how much will it hurt to move today? So as I said, I rushed in for treatment 9 months later and started seeing this chiropractor 3 times a week. We did treatment, and she did assure me that it would get much worse before it got better. So I very much looked forward to that little ride. And I also started, I saw a physical therapist who gave me strengthening therapy to work with. I was lifting weights to strengthen muscles, and I was walking daily. Living in this chronic pain, I did the physical therapy 3 times a day for 2 years. I did the chiropractic visits 3 times a week for I don't know how long, and then we got it down to twice a week and down to once a week, and doing the weights. And when I went to see, I was also seeing a counselor because, funniest thing, I was so full of rage and anger and depression. My mantra was, I want my life back, I want my body back. I was a very physically active, young person. I want my life back, I want my body back. And here's what the rage looked like in me. I would lie in bed with my spasms and my electric impulses, and I would visualize, did I mention the driver was an employee at one of the groups that I serviced. My insurance company tracked him down through the vehicle description and the license plate. And somewhere along the line, I had gotten an attorney for my insurance company to sue his insurance company for medical expenses and damage and so forth. So somewhere along the line, we sat in this 5-hour deposition. I sat across the table from him, and I would see him when I went out to the employer to do work with them. Sat across the table from him and listened to him say that he was not driving his vehicle that day. No one was driving his vehicle that day. His vehicle, the black Chevy S10 with the red trim with the license plate that belonged to him, which I had recorded, that vehicle was not on Blair's Ferry Road that day. And then I told my story, and I was countered and challenged by the attorney through the whole. I remember I had to take several breaks from the room to compose myself. So we'd had that situation. I had this driver that wasn't in his car didn't hit me, and my vision, my rageful vision, lying in bed, was to see this young man who was slightly mentally, developmentally impaired, to see this young man lying on his back in my driveway with me repeatedly putting it in drive, putting it in reverse for months because I wanted someone, particularly him, to feel my pain. I wanted someone, the cause of my suffering. I wanted them to suffer. I continued to do all of the physical work, continued with my mantra. I'm lying in my counselor's office because I don't sit in chairs. I had bought a standing work surface for work, so I didn't have to sit. And so I'm lying in my counselor's office. I would lie on the floor, and she would sit in her chair like this so we could have a face-to-face visit. And I'm weeping my way through the visit, and she looks down and says to me, I'm going to send you to a psychiatrist. And in tears, I said, do you think we really need to do that? And she said, it's not optional. So she made an appointment with the psychiatrist. I went to see him. He asked the background. I told him about the day of the accident, the timeline of getting treatment, and where I was. By this time, I was probably a good 1.5 2 years in since the accident. And he looks at me and says, well, you know, it was called soft tissue injury. He said, well, you know, the majority of healing takes place in the first 6 months. Oh, I didn't know that. And then he said, very clearly, so this is how you'll feel for the rest of your life. I remember the moment so clearly because my response was not intellectual. My response was a visceral, how can that be? And then I did the math and thought, well, if I live approximately as long as my parents are living, that's another 45 years. And all this took a moment. I did the math. This was all internal. I had not spoken. And I looked at him and I said, no, I'm not doing that. So he prescribed the happy pills, and it took a few brands to figure out which one was effective. Somewhere along the line of this whole recovery business, all I had was this nugget. How can that be? I knew it wasn't truth. And mind you, the accident was in '93, and I really woke up, and I had been attending Unity for some time, but I really woke up and studied as much as I could. Started the, back then, CEP classes, SEE classes, and was taking every class I could at our center. So there was a visiting minister who gave a workshop on a book that's no longer in print called Proclamations of the Soul. Has anybody ever seen that book? We're going through, in this Sunday afternoon workshop, we're going through these proclamations, and we did the proclamations together. There was a proclamation on forgiveness. And this light bulb lit up in me, and again, it was this visceral, oh, that's my healing. Didn't know what it meant, didn't know how to go about it, didn't have, a coach or a guide, or there weren't linear steps in the book, of which I am very fond. So I started a process in my meditation of doing the forgiveness work, and along the way, I came awake to my own metaphysical malpractice of blaming myself for attracting the injury, attracting the accident. My life had come to this horrible, long, slow, screeching halt by the way, the life in which my new plan would begin. Let's not forget that little factor. And I realized that I had been telling myself all along that I was wrong for having gone through this much suffering and gone through this much pain. And that I was more spiritual than that. You know, here I had these principles and these people telling me that it could be different. So in the mix of the proclamations of the soul, in the midst of self-forgiveness, I asked myself a couple of difficult questions, and one question was, how am I using this pain for my benefit? That was a hard one. And the other question is, do I really want to wait for Billy, the driver, to come to me and say, I screwed up, I was so scared, I drove away, I'm sorry? I could wait for that. I could, and I had been holding very tightly to that for the first few years. So the spiritual transformation came in, first of all, the knowing, how can that be? And coming back to Myrtle, I am a child of God. I'm a creation. I'm a creation of the universe. I'm a creation of God mind. I'm a creation of life, love, energy. I'm not intended to be in pain. I'm not intended to suffer. And if my recovery is contingent on another person, I felt like I was in trouble if I was counting on that. So my instantaneous recovery took until I came here for the ministerial program in 2003. So it was just 10 years. In that 10 years, much happened. You know, that getting out of the 10 plus chronic pain level probably took about 5 years or so. And then just dealing with, you know, I had it down to a dull roar, let's just put it that way. And I always knew that I am whole. And that somehow, some way, mind, body, spirit come together, question the error beliefs, question what I think has to have happened, pardon me, in order for me to heal. And what was it you said, Erin, about the shadow? And that was the other thing, was the wall of resistance. That was a huge turning piece for me because I was so resistant. I wanted it to be over. I wanted it to be over yesterday. And in that mix of the proclamations of the soul, and in that mix of realizing I had to release, I no longer ran over him in my driveway. I felt like that was a really good transition for me. I felt like I was being very spiritually mature, that I could release him. And I also learned that it was my resistance. I remember the great Robert Brummett saying to us, P plus R equals S. Anyone know that formula? Pain plus resistance equals suffering. So I knew I had to lay down my resistance. And I had to invite in chronic pain. And I had to inquire within about what's it like to just live in acceptance and to not push back. It was a shadow. And the more I pushed back, the bigger and meaner the shadow got. And so I learned. That was an interesting piece because we invited in without attachment. It didn't get to furnish the hut. It did not get to plan any decor. I knew it was a visitor. So I would say the bottom line of it is non-resistance, holding to truth, as Erin mentioned, however that truth comes to us. My healing story won't be anyone else's healing story, but there might be pieces of it. There might be nuggets that sing in you and that ring of truth in you. So I stand here pain-free, as physically active as I want to be, and grateful for the shadow. I wouldn't know light if I did not know the deep, deep darkness. It's all part of the whole, yes? One more quote from the great Norma Iris Rosado. What we call healing is a return to wholeness. Namaste.